Have you ever been grounded at 30 years old? It was not for partying or a scandal. It was because I dared to tell my father not to sign a $19 billion contract. He confiscated my phone and my autonomy, thinking silence would break me. He has no idea I built a secret AI that sees every crack in his perfect empire. If you believe money solves family problems, you need to hear this. The real price is the truth. My name is Josephine Gray. I am 30 years old. I hold a Master of Business Administration from Wharton and a Master of Science in Data Systems from MIT. I can write code in 4 languages and read a balance sheet in 3 more. I understand the intricate, invisible circulatory system of global logistics better than the senators who regulate it, and certainly better than the bankers who finance it. And yet, exactly 45 minutes ago, my father sent me to my room. He did not say it with the heat of a parent scolding a teenager who missed curfew. There was no shouting. There was no red-faced loss of temper. That would have been too human for Wade Mercer. Instead, he delivered the command with the same terrifying Arctic calm he uses to liquidate subsidiaries or fire executives who have served him for 20 years. He stood behind his desk, a slab of black marble that costs more than the average American home. And he looked at me, not as his daughter, but as a malfunctioning asset, a piece of software that had failed to execute a simple command. "Give it to me," he said. He held out a hand. It was a hand that had shaken presidents and prime ministers, a hand that had steered the Mercer Atlas Group from a regional trucking fleet into a global leviathan of logistics, data infrastructure, and automated security. I hesitated. The silence in the office was so heavy it felt pressurized, like being at the bottom of the ocean. "The phone, Josephine," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "And the laptop. Place them on the desk." I looked at Graham. My brother was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline as if he were posing for a magazine cover that wasn't being shot yet. That is Graham's default state ready for the camera. He is the crown prince of the Mercer Empire, 34 years old, jawline like a statue, hair perfectly swept back, and a soul that I am convinced was removed surgically when he was 12 to make room for more ambition. He took a sip of his scotch and didn't look at me. He let the silence stretch, enjoying the spectacle of my humiliation. I placed my phone on the cold marble. Then I pulled my slim laptop from my bag and placed it on top. The sound of the aluminum casing hitting the stone echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You are confined to the penthouse until further notice," my father said. He didn't even look at the devices. He was looking at a point just above my left shoulder, erasing me from his direct line of sight. "Security has been instructed to deny you exit. The elevators will not respond to your biometrics. You will not attend the gala. You will not speak to the press. You will not leave this building until you learn the definition of loyalty." "Loyalty?" I asked. My voice sounded small, and I hated it. I cleared my throat and made it sharper. "Is that what you call it?" I thought loyalty meant protecting this family from ruin. "Ruin," Graham scoffed. Finally turning around, the ice cubes clinked in his glass. "She calls the deal of the century ruin. This is why we don't let you talk in meetings. Joe, you have a flair for the dramatic that borders on hysteria." "It is not hysteria," I said, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "It is math. I showed you the models. The Greyhaven Port Nexus is a trap. The revenue projections assume a 300% increase in automated shipping volume within 6 months. That is a statistical impossibility. And the partner group. Their liquidity is entirely leveraged against. Enough." Wade Mercer slammed his palm on the desk. It was the only crack in his armor, a single flash of the violence that lived beneath the tailored Italian suits. "I did not build this empire by listening to the timid projections of a girl who has never closed a deal in her life. I built it on vision, on instinct. The Greyhaven deal is the future of Mercer Atlas. It is $19 billion of infrastructure that will cement our legacy for the next 50 years. And you." He pointed a finger at me, a weapon loaded with disappointment. "You refuse to stand in the frame. You refuse to support your family. That was the crime. It wasn't embezzlement. It wasn't a drug scandal. It wasn't a leaked sex tape. My crime was that earlier this afternoon, during the preliminary press briefing for the $19 billion Greyhaven acquisition, I had refused to walk onto the stage. The photographers were there. The partners from the consortium were there, smiling their shark-like smiles. Graham was there, looking like the golden heir, and Wade Mercer was waiting for his perfect family tableau. He needed the optics, the grieving widower, though my mother is very much alive, just emotionally embalmed in her own wing of the house, and his two brilliant children, united in their support of his genius. But I had stayed in the green room. I had looked at the contract one last time, my stomach churning as the numbers danced before my eyes. I saw the hollow shell of the shell companies. I saw the debt structures that looked like support beams but were actually dynamite. I couldn't do it. I couldn't smile and clap for a funeral. So I stayed back, and when the press asked where Josephine was, the Mercer Atlas PR team had to scramble and lie, claiming I had taken ill. To Wade Mercer, that was unforgivable. I had embarrassed him. I had cracked the image of the monolithic Mercer front. "Go to your quarters," my father said, turning his back on me to look at the city he believed he owned. "Think about your place in this world. Josephine, without me, without the name Mercer, you are nothing. You are a trust fund baby playing at being an intellectual. Until you are ready to apologize and take your place in the photograph, you do not exist to the outside world." I looked at Graham one last time. He raised his glass in a mock toast, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. He had won. He always won. He was the one who whispered in Father's ear that I was unstable, that I was jealous, that my warnings were just desperate cries for attention. I turned and walked out of the office. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me, sealing the tomb. The walk to the private elevator felt like a procession to the gallows. The hallway was lined with real Monets, real Picassos that my father collected not because he loved them, but because they were expensive. They were assets, just like Graham, just like me. I pressed the button for the penthouse level. The elevator arrived instantly, silent and smooth. As I stepped in, two members of the Mercer private security team stepped in with me. I knew them. One was Miller, a man who had taught me how to throw a punch in the company gym when I was 16. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. He knew this was wrong. He knew treating a 30-year-old woman like a prisoner was insane, but he also knew who signed his checks. "I'm sorry, Miss Gray," Miller murmured as the doors closed, sealing us in the capsule. "Don't be," I said, staring at my reflection in the polished steel doors. I looked tired. My hair was pulled back too tight. My suit was severe. I looked like a woman who was trying very hard to be taken seriously and failing. "You have your orders, Miller." The elevator opened directly into my living quarters. It is technically a separate apartment, occupying the entire top floor of the Mercer Tower. It is 4,000 square feet of minimalist luxury. White marble floors, white leather furniture, walls of glass that offer a 360-degree view of the city. It is beautiful, it is breathtaking, and it is a cage. The doors slid shut behind me, and I heard the distinct mechanical thud of the lock engaging. The panel that usually allowed me to call the elevator went dark. Access denied. I stood in the center of the vast, silent room. The air conditioning hummed, a low, artificial breath that scrubbed the air of any scent of the real world. I walked to the window and pressed my hand against the cold glass. Down below, cars moved like corpuscles through the veins of the city. Thousands of people were rushing to dinner, to bars, to second jobs, to lovers, to arguments. They were messy and free. I was trapped in the sky, suspended in a vacuum of wealth. I walked to the kitchen island, empty. My housekeeper had evidently been dismissed for the duration of my punishment. I opened the fridge, fully stocked, still water, sparkling water, organic fruit, pre-made meals from the private chef downstairs, everything I needed to survive, provided I remained a good little pet. I went to the wall panel where the smart home controls lived. I tapped the screen to access the news. Access restricted. I tried to access my email. Access restricted. I tried to make a call on the landline, an antique thing kept for aesthetics. No dial tone. Wade was thorough. He didn't just want me grounded. He wanted me isolated. He wanted me to sit in this silence until the crushing weight of my own irrelevance forced me to crawl back to him and beg for forgiveness. He wanted me to admit that I was just a girl, that the numbers were too big for my pretty little head, that he was the titan who held the sky up, and I should just be grateful for the shade. I paced the length of the room. My heels clicked sharply on the stone. They thought they had stripped me. They thought that by taking my phone and my laptop, they had severed my connection to the world. It was a logical assumption for men like Wade and Graham. To them, technology was a tool you bought at a store. It was a rectangular slab of glass and metal that you held in your hand. If you take the slab away, the power is gone. They are analog men living in a digital world they think they control because they can buy the servers. I stopped pacing. I looked at the massive, abstract painting hanging above the fireplace. It was a swirl of chaotic grays and blacks, commissioned by my mother years ago to match the rug. I walked over to it. I reached behind the frame, my fingers tracing the canvas until I felt the slight indentation in the wall behind it. I pressed. A small panel popped open. Inside, sitting in a nest of wires that I had spliced into the building's main power grid 3 years ago, was a device. It wasn't sleek like an iPhone. It was a Frankenstein monster of circuitry, a Raspberry Pi cluster modified with a high-gain antenna and an e-ink display, powered directly by the building's emergency circuit. It was ugly, industrial, and completely invisible to the standard network scans my father's IT team ran. I pulled it out. The screen flickered to life. It was slow, monochromatic, and text-based. It looked like something from the 1980s, but it was alive. I typed in a command string. The keyboard was a small, tactile projection on the floor. But I didn't need comfort. I needed code. Connection established. Node Penthouse Alpha. User J. Gray. Status active. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Wade Mercer had confiscated my phone. He had confiscated my laptop, but he didn't know about Aurora. Aurora was not a person. I called it a she. Though the code was genderless, was a predictive algorithm I had been building since I was 22. I had written her in the lonely hours of the night, during those endless charity galas where I was ignored, during the vacations where I was left in the hotel room while Graham went hunting with Father. I had fed Aurora everything, every public filing of Mercer Atlas Group, every chaotic fluctuation of the global shipping index, every leaked email from the dark web concerning logistics contracts, every whisper of raw data that the internet vomited up every second. Aurora didn't just read the news. She read the patterns between the news. She saw the ghost ships that didn't appear on official manifests. She tracked the shell companies that opened and closed in the Cayman Islands on the same day. She saw the truth that my father's expensive audits were paid to ignore. I typed a query into the terminal. Query Project Greyhaven. Risk Assessment. The screen refreshed. Lines of text began to scroll, white against the gray background of the e-ink. Entity, North Glass Capital. Partner solvency. Critical failure detected. Debt ratio 92%. Flag cross collateralized assets. Warning asset inflation detected. I stared at the screen. It was worse than I thought. The prestigious partner my father was getting into bed with wasn't just broke. They were a corpse being propped up by debt designed to explode the moment the ink was dry on the merger. And then, a new line of text appeared, one I hadn't seen before. New data stream, internal comms, Mercer exec level, source encrypted channel 4, decoding. My heart hammered against my ribs. Aurora had found a leak. Someone inside the building, someone on the executive floor, was communicating with the outside on a back channel. I read the decoded fragment. It was a timestamp from 2 hours ago, just before the press briefing. MSG. She knows too much. If she doesn't sign, we bypass her. The collapse needs to happen on her watch or the dad's, not ours. I froze. She knows too much. They weren't talking about a rival. They were talking about me. I looked around the silent, luxurious penthouse. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the white furniture. My father thought he was punishing a rebellious daughter. He thought he was teaching me a lesson about hierarchy. He thought he had locked a petulant child in her room to cool off. He was wrong. He hadn't locked me in here to keep me away from the world. He had inadvertently locked me in the cockpit. He had removed all the distractions, the dinners, the appearances, the noise, and left me alone with the one thing that could dismantle his entire reality. I sat down on the floor, the cold marble seeping through my skirt, the primitive hacking deck glowing in my hands. "Okay, Dad," I whispered to the empty room. "You want me to be a mercer? You want me to play the game?" I typed a new command. Aurora initiate protocol dismantle. Target Mercer Cap. Atlas Group. The screen blinked once. Confirm this action is irreversible. I looked at the confirmation prompt. I thought about Graham's smirk. I thought about my father's cold, dismissive hand wave. I thought about the $19 billion they were about to burn, dragging thousands of employees' pensions down with them. I didn't hesitate. Confirmed. Wade Mercer had grounded me. He had taken away my freedom, but he had made a fatal calculation error. He thought power was about who sat in the biggest chair. He forgot that in the modern world, power belongs to the one who controls the flow of information. He locked the door, but he forgot to check the walls. And now, the walls were about to start talking. The silence of the penthouse was not new to me. In fact, silence was the primary soundtrack of my childhood. People look at the photos in the society pages, the glossy spreads of the Mercer family skiing in Aspen or sailing off the coast of Capri, and they see a fairy tale. They see a golden boy and a golden girl, raised in a world without friction. They do not see the invisible wires that held us in place, taut and ready to snap if we moved even an inch out of alignment. I learned to read a room before I learned to read a book. My education did not begin at the prestigious prep school where the tuition cost more than a luxury sedan. It began at the dinner table. Dinner was not a meal. It was a performance review. I remember being 7 years old. I was sitting at a mahogany table that was long enough to land a small aircraft on. My feet did not touch the floor. I was wearing a dress that scratched at my neck, because comfort was irrelevant when compared to presentation. My French tutor had left a report on my father's desk earlier that afternoon. I had conjugated a verb incorrectly during our lesson. It was a small error, a slip of the tongue common for a second grader learning a second language. Wade Mercer did not yell. He never yelled. He simply sliced his steak with surgical precision and said that mediocrity was a disease. He told me that a Mercer does not make mistakes because a Mercer is not like other people. We are the standard. If the standard falters, the market loses confidence. I did not know what a market was at 7, but I knew that I had failed him. I knew that his love was not a baseline. It was a dividend paid out only when quarterly performance met expectations. My mother, Mary Ann, sat across from him. She was beautiful in the way a porcelain doll is beautiful, flawless, painted, and terrified of shattering. She had been an actress once, a rising star on the Broadway stage with a laugh that could fill a theater. But Wade Mercer had acquired her. Just as he acquired his shipping fleets and his data centers, he had polished her, renamed her, and placed her in the role of the perfect wife. She smiled through that entire dinner. She always smiled. It was her armor. I learned later that she drank a bottle of white wine every afternoon just to numb herself enough to get through the evening inspection. She taught me that survival meant silence. She taught me that if you made yourself small enough, beautiful enough, and quiet enough, the men might forget to be angry. But I was not good at being small. Graham was different. If I was the ornament, Graham was the weapon. He was 4 years older than me, and from the moment he could walk, he was being trained to rule. When he broke a vase or failed a test, it was treated as an excess of spirit, a sign of a dominant nature that just needed harnessing. When I failed, it was a defect. They sent him to leadership camps where he learned to give orders. They sent me to etiquette classes where I learned how to fold a napkin and how to listen to boring men speak without letting my eyes glaze over. You are the soft power, Josephine, my father told me on my 16th birthday. He had just gifted me a diamond necklace that felt cold against my skin. Graham is the iron. You are the velvet glove. You make people feel comfortable, so Graham can cut their throats. He thought that was a compliment. He thought he was giving me a purpose. I hated the velvet. I hated the softness. I hated the expectation that my greatest contribution to the world would be my ability to host a gala and look appreciative while men like my father destroyed ecosystems and crushed competitors. I found my escape in the one place where gender and last names did not exist. I found it in the glowing green text of a command line. I started coding when I was 13. It was an accident. Really. I had stumbled upon a manual for basic programming in the library of one of our summer homes, a book left behind by some previous tenant. I opened it and felt a jolt of electricity. Here was a world that made sense. Here was a world where if followed then, where variables were constant unless you changed them, where logic was king. In the real world, the rules changed constantly. My father's mood shifted like the wind. My mother's affection was dependent on her sobriety. Graham's kindness was a transactional currency, but in the code, 2 + 2 always equaled 4. If the code failed, it was because I had made a mistake, not because the computer woke up in a bad mood. It was fair. It was the only fair thing in my life. I became obsessed. I spent my nights under the covers with a laptop I had bought with cash. I skimmed from my allowance, learning Python, C++, and Java. I built firewalls. I broke into secure servers just to see if I could, leaving no trace behind but a digital ghost. I loved the anonymity. On the internet, I wasn't Josephine Mercer, the billionaire's daughter. I was just a mind. I was just user zero. When I graduated from college top of my class, though my father only cared that I didn't trip on stage, I was given a position at Mercer Atlas Group. It was a vice president title. It came with a corner office, a 6-figure salary, and absolutely no responsibility. I was a diversity hire in my own family's company. I attended board meetings, but I was not expected to speak. I was there to soften the image of the all-male board. I was there to be the modern face of the company for the annual report. I would sit there, watching them make decisions based on ego and gut instinct, watching them ignore the data that was screaming at them from the spreadsheets. "Let the men talk, sweetheart," a senior partner whispered to me once when I tried to point out a flaw in a supply chain projection. Graham had chuckled. My father had not even looked up from his notes. That was the day I decided to stop trying to be heard and start listening. That was the day I started building Aurora. I named her after the dawn, because I knew she would eventually shed light on everything they tried to keep in the dark. I didn't build her on company servers. I built her on a decentralized network of private servers I rented under shell identities. I fed her everything. I wrote scrapers that pulled public maritime records, satellite weather data, labor union newsletters, and raw commodity prices. I taught her to look for correlations that human analysts missed, while my father and Graham were toasting each other with scotch, bragging about their intuition. Aurora was crunching 3 terabytes of data a second. She became my secret weapon. And ironically, she became their savior. 2 years ago, there was a massive bottleneck in the rare earth mineral supply chain. The analysts at Mercer Atlas predicted it would clear up in 2 weeks. They advised my father to double down on inventory. Aurora saw something else. She saw a subtle shift in local political rhetoric in the mining region, correlated with a spike in obscure labor forum chatter. She predicted a 6-month strike. If my father had bought the inventory, the company would have been stuck with $2 billion of immovable assets. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't say, "My secret AI thinks you are wrong." So I manipulated the data packet that was sent to Graham. I adjusted the risk margins in the report he was about to present. I made it look like his idea to pull back. Graham presented the caution as his own brilliance. My father applauded his foresight. The strike happened exactly as Aurora predicted. Mercer Atlas saved hundreds of millions of dollars. Graham got a bonus that could have bought a small island, and I got silence. That was the deal I made with myself. I would let them have the glory. I would let them think they were geniuses. In exchange, I got to keep my secret. I got to keep the one thing that was truly mine. It was a lonely victory, but it felt safer than exposure. I was the ghost in the machine, patching the holes in the ship while the captain drank on the bridge. But the more Aurora learned, the more I began to see the cracks in the foundation. My father loves to tell the story of Mercer Atlas. It is the classic American myth. He started with one truck and a dream. He pulled himself up by his bootstraps. He outworked everyone. It is a story he tells at every gala, every shareholder meeting, every interview. It is the story that Graham has memorized and repeats like a catechism. We built this from dirt, Wade likes to say. We owe nothing to anyone. Aurora does not care about myths. Aurora cares about data points. And as I began to digitize the archived records of the company for a historical analysis project I was pretending to lead, the timeline started to glitch. There were gaps. There were 3 years in the early 1980s where the financial records were incredibly vague. There were patent filings for the core logistics algorithms, the very heart of our tracking technology that appeared out of nowhere, fully formed, signed by my father 3 days after a subsidiary company was dissolved. And there was a name. It wasn't in the official history books. It wasn't on the plaques in the lobby, but it appeared in the metadata of the oldest digitized contracts. A co-signatory whose signature had been legally redacted, but the digital footprint remained. Aurora flagged it as an anomaly, a variable that had been deleted but had left a gravitational pull on everything that followed. I tried to ask my mother about those early days once. We were sitting in the sunroom, the air thick with the smell of orchids. She was on her 3rd glass of Chardonnay. "Mom," I asked casually, "did Dad have a partner when he started before the big expansion in '85? Her hand froze halfway to her mouth. The glass trembled, just for a fraction of a second, before she set it down with a sharp clink. The smile that practiced Mercer smile wavered. Her eyes darted to the door, checking for Wade, checking for microphones, checking for ghosts. "Your father built this company alone. Josephine," she said. Her voice was brittle, like dry leaves. "He has always been alone. That is what makes him great. Never ask that question again." She stood up and walked out of the room, leaving her wine unfinished. That was when I knew. The self-made billionaire was a fabrication. The empire wasn't built on just hard work and vision. It was built on a grave. I didn't know whose grave it was then. I didn't know the depth of the lie. I just knew that my father was not the god he pretended to be. He was a man who had buried something deep, and he had spent 40 years shoveling money on top of it to keep it hidden. And now, sitting on the floor of my penthouse prison, with the red light of the server blinking in the darkness, I realized that the Greyhaven deal wasn't just another bad business move. It was the climax of a lifetime of arrogance. He believed his own myth so completely that he thought he was invincible. He thought he could bend reality to his will just by signing a check. But he had forgotten the one lesson I learned in the code. Garbage in, garbage out. If you build a system on a lie, eventually, the error propagates. Eventually, the system crashes. I looked at the screen of my device. Aurora was waiting for the next command. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic heartbeat in the silence. My father had grounded me to teach me a lesson about power. He wanted me to understand that I was small. But as I looked at the cascading streams of data, the hidden debts, the leveraged lies, and the secret history of the Mercer Empire, I didn't feel small. I felt like the only adult in the room. The time for being the velvet glove was over. The time for saving them from themselves was over. I had spent my life trying to fit into their frame, trying to be the daughter they wanted, but they didn't want a daughter. They wanted a reflection. Well, I was about to hold up a mirror, and I knew they were not going to like what they saw. "Aurora," I whispered, "show me the money trail. Show me where the bodies are buried." The screen flooded with data, and for the first time in my life, inside this golden cage, I smiled. It wasn't the polite smile my mother taught me. It was the smile of a wolf who just realized the fence is down. The screen of my secure terminal did not just blink, it bled. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, 6 hours before the final board ratification of the Greyhaven Port Nexus deal. The penthouse was submerged in darkness, save for the aggressive red glow emanating from Aurora's primary display. I had set her to run a deep-dive heuristic analysis on the environmental compliance documents that Northglass Capital had uploaded to the data room only 40 minutes prior. They had tried to bury the files. They uploaded them in a batch of 3,000 scanned PDFs, buried under mundane title deeds and insurance certificates, betting that no human analyst would have the caffeine or the stamina to review them before the market opened. They were right. No human analyst would. But Aurora did not drink coffee, and she did not sleep. She had flagged a catastrophic anomaly. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the lines of code that Aurora had highlighted. It was the environmental impact assessment for the dredging of the new Deepwater Channel. On the surface, it looked perfect. It had the seals of the Environmental Protection Agency and the local maritime authority. It had the signatures. It had the timestamps. But Aurora looked at the metadata. The pixel density of the signatures was identical down to the exact fractal variation to a permit granted for a completely different project in Louisiana 5 years ago. They were not just forged. They were lazy digital photocopies. Then, she cross-referenced the soil density reports with public satellite imagery of the coastline. The report claimed the seabed was solid granite, perfect for heavy infrastructure. The satellite thermal imaging, which Aurora had scraped from a university geological survey, showed soft silt and shifting sand. If we built on that land, the foundations would crack within 18 months. The cost to repair it would not be in the millions. It would be in the billions. And because the permits were forged, the insurance would be void. Mercer Atlas would be left holding a $19 billion bag of sinking mud and criminal liability. I did not panic. Panic is a waste of bandwidth. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I opened a fresh document. I did not include the code. Wade and Graham did not speak code. They spoke risk. I translated Aurora's findings into 3 brutal bullet points. 1 legal risk. The permits are fraudulent Class B felonies. The moment this deal is signed, the Department of Justice has grounds to freeze our assets. 2 political risk. The projected job creation numbers are mathematically impossible given the automation levels. When the unions find out, the Senate hearings will decimate our stock price. 3 financial risk. The partner, Northglass, has structured the debt so that in the event of an environmental halt, the repayment obligation accelerates immediately. They are not partnering with us. They are shorting us. I printed the single page. It felt light in my hand, but I knew it had the weight of a guillotine blade. I dressed in a charcoal suit, no jewelry, no soft colors. I pulled my hair back so tight it hurt. I was not going down there as Josephine, the daughter. I was going down there as the only person in the building who was awake. I took the elevator down to the executive floor. The building was quiet, the janitorial staff moving like ghosts in the periphery, but the lights were blazing in the main boardroom. I walked past the executive assistant's desk. She was startled, jumping up as I strode past. "Ms. Gray, your father is in a closed session with Graham and the legal team. You cannot—" I pushed open the double glass doors without breaking stride. The room smelled of stale coffee and expensive tension. Wade sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened, a rare sign of fatigue. Graham was to his right, looking fresh and manic, riding the adrenaline of the impending victory. 5 lawyers from our external counsel sat around them, looking like vultures waiting for a carcass. The conversation stopped dead. "Josephine," Graham said, his voice dripping with that patronizing, exhausted patience he reserved for me. "We are finishing the final schedule reviews. The signing ceremony is in 4 hours. Go get your hair done." I walked to the head of the table. I did not sit. I placed the single sheet of paper directly on top of the leather-bound deal book in front of my father. "Do not sign it," I said. My voice was steady. It did not tremble. Wade looked at the paper, then up at me. His eyes were hard, the blue of a frozen lake. We are past the discussion phase. Josephine, the board votes at 9 o'clock. There won't be a board vote if you read that, I said. Northglass is defrauding us. The environmental permits are forgeries. The seabed data is falsified. If you execute this contract, you are buying a federal investigation and a guaranteed bankruptcy. Graham let out a short, sharp laugh. He reached out and snatched the paper from under my father's hand. He scanned it, his eyes flicking over the words, not absorbing them, just looking for reasons to dismiss them. Forged permits, Graham scoffed, tossing the paper back onto the table. We have had 3 independent audit firms review the data room. Josephine, 3? Are you telling me that you, in your bedroom, found something that 200 lawyers missed? Yes, I said, locking eyes with him. Because your lawyers are looking at what Northglass wants them to see. They are looking at the documents. I looked at the metadata. Metadata, one of the external lawyers muttered, rolling his eyes. Mr. Mercer, the due diligence period is closed. These are last-minute jitters. It happens with every mega merger. It is not jitters, I snapped, turning on the lawyer. It is forensic fact. The signatures on the EPA approval match a document from a Louisiana dredging project in 2018. The probability of that happening naturally is 1 in 4 trillion. It is a copy-paste job. A child could see it if they knew where to look. Wade raised a hand. The room went silent. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since I entered. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a calculating assessment. Where did you get this, Josephine? He asked softly. You do not have access to the raw data room. Graham revoked your clearance last week to keep the team streamlined. I hesitated. I knew this was the ledge. If I stepped off, there was no going back. But I had to make him believe the data. I had to show him that this wasn't just a guess. I have a system, I said. I built an artificial intelligence. It scrapes data from the public web and cross-references it with our internal traffic. I call it Aurora. It has been running simulations on this deal for 3 months. It predicted the supply chain crisis last year. It predicted the labor strike in Detroit. And it is predicting, with 99% certainty, that Greyhaven is a shell game. The silence that followed was not the silence of awe. It was the silence of disbelief. Graham looked at his father, a smirk spreading across his face. An AI, he repeated, savoring the absurdity of the word. She built a robot friend. Did you hear that? Wade, our sister, is basing a $19 billion decision on a computer game she coded in her spare time. It is not a game, I insisted, my hands pressing flat against the cold mahogany table. It is an algorithmic risk engine. It is smarter than everyone in this room combined because it doesn't have an ego. Dad, listen to me. Northglass is banking on you being too proud to back out. They know you need this legacy. They are playing you. That was the mistake. I saw the change in Wade's eyes instantly. I had challenged his competence. I had suggested that he, the titan of industry, was being played. Wade stood up. He did not look at the paper. He did not ask to see the code. He reached out, took the report I had spent hours refining, and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. Then he tore it again. The sound of the thick paper ripping was louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. He dropped the pieces onto the floor. They fluttered down like dead leaves. You are done, Wade said. His voice was a low rumble, terrifyingly calm. I have tolerated your eccentricities. Josephine, I have allowed you to play at business. I gave you a title. I gave you an office. But you come into my boardroom on the most important day of this company's history, and you insult my judgment with fairy tales about secret computer programs. It is the truth, I cried out, desperation clawing at my throat. Just look at the files. Give me 5 minutes to show you the source code. There is no source code, Graham shouted, slamming his hand on the table, sensing his father's mood and amplifying it. It is jealousy. You cannot stand that I am closing the deal of the century, You are hysterical. Joe, you are embarrassing yourself. Wade walked around the table until he was standing inches from me. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold resolve. There will be no more computers, he said. There will be no more systems. You are clearly unwell. The stress of your position, which you are evidently unqualified for, has caused a break in your reality. He turned to the head of security, who was standing by the door. Confiscate her electronics. All of them. Wipe her server access. She is to have no contact with the outside world until the deal is closed and the stock price stabilizes. You can't do that, I whispered, stepping back. I'm 30 years old. I'm a shareholder. I am the chairman, Wade said, his voice like granite. And you are a liability. You will go upstairs to your apartment. You will put on the dress your mother selected, and at 2:00, you will come down to the atrium. You will stand next to your brother. You will smile. You will clap when I sign the papers. You will be the supportive daughter, or I will have you declared mentally incompetent and stripped of your trust fund before the ink is dry. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear. Do not test me, Josephine. I built this world. I can remove you from it. I looked at him. I looked at the man who I had spent my entire life trying to impress. And in that moment, the illusion broke. I didn't see a genius. I didn't see a father. I saw a dinosaur. I saw a man so blinded by his own reflection that he would march off a cliff rather than listen to a warning from a woman. I looked at Graham. He was beaming, victorious. He thought he had won. He thought he had silenced the annoying little sister. They didn't understand. They thought they were taking away my toys. They thought they were sending a child to her room. Fine, I said. My voice was cold. It surprised even me. I will go upstairs. I will smile. But remember this moment, Dad. Remember that I tried to hand you the parachute, and you set it on fire. I turned on my heel and walked out. I didn't run. I didn't cry. As the doors swung shut behind me, I heard Graham laugh. Finally. Now let's get this done. I walked to the elevator, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. They were going to sign the deal. They were going to lock me up. They were going to strip me of my access, my phone, my laptop. But as the elevator began its ascent to the penthouse, a dark realization settled over me. This wasn't a business disagreement anymore. This wasn't a corporate dispute. They had just declared me an enemy of the state. They had threatened my sanity, my freedom, and my identity. Wade Mercer had just proven that to him. I was not a person. I was property. I watched the floor numbers tick upward. 20, 30, 40. They wanted a war. They had no idea. They were fighting with money and ego. I was fighting with the truth. I entered the penthouse. The morning sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon, painting the city in shades of blood and gold. I walked to the window and looked down at the streets below. I knew what I had to do. They had cut the lines. They had burned the bridge. So I was going to blow up the castle. The air in the penthouse was scrubbed so clean it felt sterile, like the oxygen inside a space station. For the last 6 hours, since my father's security team had escorted me back upstairs and disabled the elevators, I had been pacing the perimeter of my cage. The walls were glass, offering a panoramic view of Manhattan, a city of 8 million people living messy, chaotic, free lives. I could see the traffic on the avenues, the steam rising from the vents, the lights flickering on in office buildings where people were working late by choice, not by decree. It is a specific kind of torture to be able to see the world, but not touch it. I was a specimen in a high-rise terrarium. My father had not just grounded me. He had placed me in a suspended animation. He assumed that silence would break me. He assumed that without my phone, without my title, and without his approval, I would wither. At 4 p.m, the elevator chimed. It was the only sound that had broken the hum of the HVAC system in hours. My mother, Mary Ann, stepped out. She was dressed in a soft, cream-colored cashmere cardigan and trousers that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She was carrying a tray with a teapot and 2 cups. She looked perfect. Her hair was immobile. Her makeup was a mask of serenity. But her eyes were darting around the room as if she expected to see blood on the walls. I was sitting on the white sofa, staring at a blank wall. I didn't move when she entered. "Josephine," she said softly, placing the tray on the coffee table. The china clinked. "I brought you some chamomile. It helps with the nerves." I looked at her. I saw the fear in her posture. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of the situation. She was afraid that the carefully constructed piece of the Mercer household was fracturing. To Marianne Mercer, conflict was a failure of etiquette. "I don't need tea, Mother," I said, keeping my voice flat. "I need a lawyer." She winced, as if I had used a profanity. She sat down on the edge of the chair, folding her hands in her lap. "Please, darling, don't be difficult. Your father is under a tremendous amount of pressure. This deal, this Greyhaven project, it is the capstone of his career. He just needs everyone pulling in the same direction." "He is driving the company off a cliff," I said, "and he just cut the brake lines." "He knows what is best," she recited, a mantra she had probably been telling herself since the 1980s. "He loves you, Joe. He just wants you to understand your role. Graham understands his role. Why must you always fight?" I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the lines of exhaustion hidden under the expensive foundation. I saw a woman who had traded her voice for a life of comfort, and who was now terrified that I was going to blow up her sanctuary. I realized then that if I kept fighting, if I kept arguing logic, they would keep the lockdown tight. They would treat me as a hostile combatant. I needed them to see me as a defeated child. I needed them to think they had won. I let my shoulders slump. I let my face crumble just enough to look broken. I looked down at my hands. "I just wanted to help," I whispered, injecting a tremor into my voice. "I just wanted him to be proud of me." The tension in my mother's shoulders released instantly. She reached out and patted my hand. "I know, sweetheart. I know. And he is proud. He just needs you to trust him. Just put on the dress for the ceremony. Stand there. Smile. For the family. Can you do that?" I took a breath. I forced myself to nod. "Okay," I said quietly. "I'll do it. I'm tired of fighting." "Good," she said, relief washing over her face. "That is my girl. I will tell Wade you are feeling better. Rest now. I'll send the stylist up at 1 o'clock. She left 10 minutes later. Convinced she had brokered a peace treaty, she thought she had soothed a rebellious daughter. She had no idea she had just cleared the room for a counterinsurgency. The moment the elevator doors sealed shut, my posture straightened. The tears I had summoned evaporated. I walked to the painting above the fireplace, checked the hallway for motion sensors, and then retrieved my device. The e-ink screen flickered to life. It was ugly, low-tech, and slow, but it was the only thing in the penthouse that Wade Mercer didn't own. I sat on the floor in the corner of the walk-in closet, the one place where there were no windows and the thick rows of designer gowns would dampen any sound. I activated Aurora. Session restored. Analysis complete. Greyhaven financial structure. I had asked Aurora to simulate the post-acquisition cash flow of the Greyhaven project. The results were scrolling across the screen in black and white text. It was a massacre. The deal wasn't designed to build a port. It was designed to default. Aurora's analysis showed that the $19 billion valuation was based on projected assets that didn't exist yet, but the debt service, the monthly payments Mercer Atlas would have to make to the lenders, was real, and it was immediate. Warning liquidity trap detected. Phase 1 funding release. 48 hours post-signing. Automatic trigger debt recall, Clause 14B. I frowned. Clause 14B. I tapped the command line, asking Aurora to pull the text of that clause from the draft contract she had scraped from the lawyer's email server. Clause 14B. In the event of an environmental audit failure, the lender reserves the right to accelerate full repayment of the principal sum within 30 days. It was a kill switch. Northglass Capital knew the environmental permits were fake. They knew an audit would fail. They had planted the fake permits, and they had written a clause that allowed them to demand all their money back the moment the fraud was discovered. Mercer Atlas would hand over $19 billion. The audit would fail. Northglass would demand the money back. But Mercer Atlas wouldn't have it anymore. It would be tied up in the acquisition. We would be insolvent. We would have to liquidate assets to pay them back. And who would be there to buy those assets for pennies on the dollar? Northglass Capital. It was a bust-out, a classic mob tactic, scaled up to the corporate level. They were going to gut my father's empire from the inside, but there was something else, a variable that didn't fit. For a scheme this complex to work, Northglass needed more than just a naive buyer. They needed someone on the inside to steer the ship into the rocks. They needed someone to ensure that the due diligence team didn't look too closely at the environmental reports. They needed someone to fast-track the signing. Query intermediary linkage. Search Mercer internal comms, Northglass origin. I waited. The screen refreshed slowly. The little hourglass icon spun. Aurora began to map the network of introduction. Who brought Northglass to the table? It wasn't a banker. It wasn't a cold call. The trail led through a shell company called Vantage Point Consulting, registered in Delaware. Vantage Point had been paid a $2 million finder's fee for introducing the deal. Vantage Point Consulting, beneficial owner, unknown. Cross-reference banking routing numbers. Aurora followed the money. The $2 million went into Vantage Point, sat for 3 days, and then was wired to an account in the Cayman Islands. Account holder, GM Private Trust. I stopped breathing. GM, Graham Mercer. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. It wasn't the air conditioning making me shiver. It was the ice in my veins. My brother wasn't just incompetent. He wasn't just an arrogant heir riding his father's coattails. He was the architect of the execution. Graham had brought the deal in. Graham had dismissed the auditors. Graham had mocked my warnings. He wasn't doing it because he was stupid. He was doing it because he was shorting his own family. He was betting against us. I thought about his smirk in the boardroom. She calls the deal of the century ruin. He knew exactly what it was. He was planning to cash out. He probably had a deal with Northglass to run the scraps of the company once Wade was forced out in disgrace. He was committing patricide, not with a knife, but with a $19 billion contract. I felt a wave of nausea. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run downstairs and shake my father until his teeth rattled. Your golden boy is Judas. But I couldn't. I was locked in. And even if I got out, Wade wouldn't believe me. He would think I forged the data. He would think I was jealous. Graham had spent 30 years building a fortress of trust with our father, while I had spent my time building algorithms. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the wall of the closet. The scale of the betrayal was paralyzing, but as the shock subsided, a new feeling took its place, a cold, hard resolve. I looked at the data again. I looked at the names of the subsidiaries that would be liquidated first if the company collapsed. The logistics division, the trucking fleet, the data entry centers. There were 40,000 employees in those divisions, people with mortgages, people with kids in college, people who didn't have trust funds or penthouses to retreat to. If Graham pulled this off, he would walk away with a golden parachute, and they would be left with nothing. I couldn't let the whole thing burn. If I detonated the bomb now, if I leaked everything indiscriminately, the stock would crash to zero, and everyone would lose. I couldn't be like them. I couldn't treat people as collateral damage. I needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. I typed a new command into Aurora. Protocol update protect core assets. Target executive level only. Mission expose Graham Mercer. I wasn't going to stop the deal. It was too late for that. The signing was in a few hours. I was going to let them sign it. I was going to let Graham walk into the trap he thought he had set for our father. But I was going to change the triggering mechanism. Instead of the company taking the fall, I was going to make sure the light shone directly on the man holding the match. I looked at the time on the corner of the e-ink display. It was 5 a.m. I stood up. My legs were stiff. I hid the device back behind the painting, securing the loose wires. I walked into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same person who had been sent to her room 12 hours ago. That woman had been a daughter seeking approval. This woman was a CEO in waiting. They wanted me to play a role, fine. I would play the role. I would put on the dress. I would smile for the cameras. I would stand next to my brother and let him think he had won. Because while he was watching the photographers, I would be watching the clock. And when the time was right, when the ink was dry and the trap was sprung, I wouldn't be the one crying for help. I would be the one holding the evidence. I walked out of the bathroom and into the sunrise-flooded living room. The city below was waking up. The game was about to begin. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't playing by the Mercer rules. I was playing by mine. I sat on the floor of the walk-in closet, surrounded by the quiet hum of the ventilation system. The digital clock on the wall read 6 in the morning. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. I had 8 hours to construct a trap that would snap the neck of a $19 billion fraud without bringing the entire Mercer house down on top of the innocent people living inside it. I needed liquidity. Real, untraceable liquidity. My personal accounts were monitored by the family office, and my corporate cards were likely already frozen by Graham's order. But Graham, for all his business degrees, lacked imagination. He assumed that because I was a Mercer, I only existed within the Mercer ecosystem. He did not know about Marble Finch LLC. It was a boring little company I had registered 5 years ago in Nevada. It had no employees, no office, and no product. It was a holding company for the dividends I had quietly siphoned off from my trust fund before they hit the main ledger small amounts, fraction of percentages that I had reinvested in high-yield bonds and boring municipal debt. To my father, it was rounding errors. To me, it was a war chest. I pulled up the Marble Finch accounts on my e-ink device, $2.4 million in liquid cash. It was nothing compared to the billions my father played with, but it was enough to buy the 2 things I needed, most silence and legal aggression. Aurora, I typed. Map the breaking points. The screen refreshed. Aurora did not give me a list. She gave me a web. It was a visual representation of the Mercer Atlas structural integrity. It looked like a bridge with cracks in the support pylons. The central pillar was the Greyhaven deal. If that deal went through, the debt load would increase by 400%. Critical point: a syndicated loan covenants. Critical point B: stock price volatility. Critical point C: audit certification. I stared at the glowing text. These were the 3 levers. The banks had lent us money based on the assumption that our stock price would stay above $80 a share. If the stock dropped below $60 for 3 consecutive days, the loans would be called. That meant the banks could demand immediate repayment of the entire principal. Graham and Wade were betting everything on the stock going up after the announcement. They were leveraging the future to pay for the present. My job was to make sure the stock went down. Not to zero. I didn't want to destroy the pensions of our truck drivers, but low enough to trigger the panic, low enough to force the board to wake up and see the rot. I needed to execute a 3-pronged attack. First, the banks. The lead underwriter for the deal was Sovereign Trust. Their chief risk officer was a man named Elias Thorne. He was a conservative, old-school banker who hated volatility. He only signed off on this deal because he believed the environmental reports were solid. I couldn't email him directly. My name would be flagged by his secretary, and Graham would be notified. I instructed Aurora to compile a data packet. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't a plea for help. It was just raw data. I had Aurora aggregate the publicly available satellite thermal imaging of the Greyhaven port site and overlay it with the geological surveys from the last 10 years. The result was undeniable. The heat signatures showed active soil erosion, where the report claimed there was solid bedrock. I didn't need to say fraud. The pictures screamed it. Send to Elias Thorne via secure relay, I typed. Subject line: unsolicited risk analysis, public domain data. I hit enter. The packet was routed through 3 servers in 3 different countries before landing in his inbox. It looked like a tip from a concerned analyst, not a sabotage attempt by a daughter. Thorne would read it. Paranoia was his job. And once he saw the discrepancy, He would make a phone call to my father's CFO that would chill the champagne before it was even poured. Second, the market reputation. I needed the story to break exactly as the ink was drying. If the news hit too early, they would cancel the signing and Graham would have time to spin a new lie. If it hit too late, the money would already be transferred to Northglass, and we would be dead. It had to be simultaneous. I used the Marble Finch account to retain a boutique law firm in DRC, one that specialized in whistleblower protection. I sent them a retainer of $50,000 with instructions to act as a courier. They were to deliver a physical envelope to the investigative desk of the Financial Chronicle at exactly 1:45 in the afternoon. The envelope contained the metadata analysis Aurora had performed. It showed the copy-paste artifacts in the EPA permits. It showed the timestamps that proved the documents were created hours before they were supposedly signed by government officials. It was a smoking gun. The journalist who received it would have 15 minutes to verify it before the signing ceremony began. That was enough time to draft a headline that would flash across every trading terminal on Wall Street just as Wade Mercer smiled for the cameras. Third, the legal stranglehold. This was the hardest part. I needed a way to stop Graham from simply blaming the failure on Northglass and walking away clean. I needed to bind him to the wreckage. "Aurora," I queried, "scan the merger agreement for liability transfer clauses." The AI scrolled through the 600-page contract. Most of it was standard boilerplate, designed to protect the executives and leave the shareholders holding the bag. But then, Aurora stopped on Clause 88D. It was a material adverse change clause, inserted by Northglass's lawyers. It stated that in the event of a regulatory halt, the acquiring entity Mercer Atlas would be liable for a breakup fee of $2 billion, payable immediately. But there was a subsection, a tiny, overlooked paragraph. Subsection 2. In the event that the regulatory halt is caused by internal negligence or failure to disclose material facts by the acquiring officers, the liability for the breakup fee pierces the corporate veil and attaches to the signatories of the due diligence completion certificate. I smiled. It was a trap Northglass had set for us. Just in case we tried to back out, they wanted to make sure they got paid even if we got cold feet. But Graham had signed the due diligence certificate. I had seen the digital copy on the server yesterday. If I could prove that Graham knew about the fraud, or should have known, then the $2 billion penalty wouldn't just hit the company. It would hit him. He would be personally liable. It would bankrupt him. It would strip him of his shares, his trust, his penthouse, and his future. I printed the clause to a PDF and saved it to a secure cloud drive. This was my knife. I would only use it if he cornered me. There was one final move, the most painful one. To survive the cash crunch that was coming, Mercer Atlas would need to sell assets. Graham would try to sell the tech division first, my division. He would try to sell the future to save his mistake. I couldn't let him do that. I had to force them to sell the past. My father's pride and joy was the legacy fleet, the original trucking division that started the company. He treated those trucks like sacred cows. They were inefficient, outdated, and bleeding money. But he refused to sell them because of sentiment. I needed a buyer lined up. I needed to show the board that we had a liquidity lifeline ready to go, so they wouldn't panic and liquidate my tech infrastructure. I used the encrypted chat function on the device to contact a proxy, a retired investment banker I had met at a charity gala years ago, a man who had always treated me with respect. "I need you to reach out to Vanguard Shipping," I typed. "Tell them that the Mercer Legacy fleet might be coming into play within 48 hours. Tell them the price is $1.5 billion, cash." The proxy hesitated. "Josephine, is that you?" "Your father would never sell the fleet. He'd sooner sell a kidney." "He won't have a choice," I replied. "Just make the call. Tell them to have the letter of intent ready by close of business today. If they have the cash ready, they can steal the backbone of our logistics network for 60 cents on the dollar." It hurt to type it. I was dismantling my father's history. I was selling the very trucks he had driven when he was a young man. But you cannot save a patient from gangrene without amputation. The fleet was the past. Aurora was the future. I had to sacrifice the museum to save the laboratory. The plan was set. The bank would panic. The press would expose the lie. The claws would trap Graham. And the rival would be standing at the gate with a check to keep the company alive, forcing Wade to sell his ego to save his business. I sat back, the adrenaline cooling into a dull ache in my shoulders. I knew what would happen next. The moment the chaos started, Graham would look for a scapegoat. He would storm into the penthouse. He would threaten me. He would say I manipulated the data, that I planted the evidence. I had to be ready for the physical confrontation. Not a fistfight. Graham was a coward, but an intimidation tactic. I went to the smart home control panel on the wall. I couldn't access the internet, but I could access the internal building diagnostics. I accessed the security camera feed for the penthouse. I set it to local record mode, bypassing the central server that Miller controlled. I positioned a small decorative vase on the coffee table to ensure it didn't block the camera's line of sight to the center of the room. Then I went to my closet and pulled out a digital voice recorder, an old journalist tool I used for memos. I taped it to the underside of the marble kitchen island. "Let him come," I whispered. "Let him scream. Let him threaten." Every word he said would be recorded. Every threat would be evidence. I checked the time. 7:30 in the morning. My mother would be waking up soon. The stylist would be arriving in a few hours to paint my face and lacquer my hair into a helmet of obedience. They wanted a doll. They wanted a prop to stand on stage and clap for the destruction of the family name. I stood up and walked to the window. The city looked different now. Yesterday, it had looked like a party I wasn't invited to. Today, it looked like a chessboard. I wasn't trapped anymore. The door was still locked. The elevator was still disabled, and the security guards were still outside. But my mind had already left the building. I had placed the charges on the structural beams of their reality. All that was left to do was wait for the clock to strike 2, and watch the gravity do its work. They thought freedom was about walking out the front door. I knew better now. Freedom wasn't about where you could go. It was about what you could control. And by the time the sun set today, Wade Mercer would realize that while he owned the building, I owned the foundation. The grand ballroom of the Mercer Plaza was not designed for parties. It was designed for coronations. The ceiling soared 50 feet above us, hung with chandeliers that dripped crystal like frozen tears. The air was cold, recycled, and smelled intensely of white lilies and ambition. 300 of the most powerful people in New York had gathered here to witness the signing of the Greyhaven-Port Nexus deal. They were here to kiss the ring. They were here to drink vintage champagne that cost more than a teacher's annual salary and to tell my father that he was a visionary. I stood by the heavy velvet curtains near the service entrance, watching the spectacle. My father had orchestrated the evening with the precision of a military parade. The stage was bathed in blue and silver light, the colors of Mercer Atlas. A massive screen behind the podium displayed the new logo of the merged entity, a sleek, predatory graphic that looked like a bird of prey diving for a kill. 10 minutes ago, the speeches had ended. Wade Mercer had stood center stage, flanked by the partners from North Glass Capital and a beaming Graham. They had signed the documents on a glass table while flashbulbs popped like lightning storms. It was the photo op of the decade. I was not in the photo. That was the final twist of the knife. That was my father's public punishment. Usually, the Mercer Trinity, Wade, Graham, and Josephine stood together. We were the brand, but tonight, Wade had given specific instructions to the stage manager. There was no mark on the floor for me. There was no chair with my name on it. I was erased. He wanted the world to see that the circle had closed and I was on the outside. He wanted the whispers to start. Where is Josephine? Is she sick? Is she out of favor? He knew that social exile was the only weapon he had left to hurt me. He was wrong. I adjusted the cuff of my dress. My mother had sent a stylist up to the penthouse with a selection of gowns, gold, sequined, loud, desperate things designed to scream, "Look at me!" I had sent them all back. Instead, I wore a vintage black silk column dress I had bought in Paris years ago. It was severe. It had long sleeves, a high neck, and a back that plunged dangerously low. It was not a party dress. It was a mourning dress. It was a piece of architecture in fabric form. In a room full of peacocks preening in feathers and diamonds, I looked like a singularity. I was a drop of ink in a glass of milk. I stepped away from the curtain and began to move through the room. The crowd was a physical barrier. Men in tuxedos that cost $5,000 stood in tight circles, laughing too loud at jokes that were not funny. Women with faces frozen by dermatologists assessed each other's jewelry with predatory glints in their eyes. I moved through them like a shark moving through a reef. I did not smile. I did not stop to exchange air kisses. Josephine. The voice belonged to Arthur Vance. He was 80 years old, a majority shareholder who had been with the company since my father had only 3 trucks to his name. Arthur was one of the few people in this room who understood that profit came from operations, not financial engineering. I stopped and turned. Arthur was holding a tumbler of scotch with a trembling hand. He looked tired. "Arthur," I said, inclining my head, "you look well." "I look like a fossil," he grumbled, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "And you look distinct. Why were you not on stage? Your father said you were feeling under the weather." "My father says many things," I replied smoothly. I kept my voice low, forcing him to lean in. It created an intimate, conspiratorial bubble in the middle of the noise. Arthur narrowed his eyes. He was sharp. He had survived 4 recessions and 3 hostile takeover attempts. He knew the smell of rot, even when it was covered in perfume. "Is everything all right, Joe?" he asked. "The market is going wild for this deal. The stock is up 4% in after-hours trading. Everyone is calling Wade a genius, but you are standing back here in the shadows." I looked over Arthur's shoulder at the stage, where Graham was currently laughing with the CEO of Northglass. They looked like 2 wolves deciding how to split a carcass. "The lighting is blinding on stage. Arthur," I said, "you cannot see the cracks in the floorboards when the spotlight is in your eyes. I find that the picture is clearest when you stand away from the center." Arthur stiffened. He looked at me. Really looked at me. He saw that I wasn't drinking. He saw that I wasn't celebrating. He saw the cold, hard calculation in my eyes. "Cracks," he whispered. "What kind of cracks?" "The kind that grow when you build on sand." I said, I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. I just let the sentence hang there, heavy and ominous. I saw the doubt bloom in his eyes. It was instant. The euphoria of the party vanished for him, replaced by the instinct of self-preservation. He looked back at Wade, but this time, he didn't see a genius. He saw a man who might be hiding something. "Excuse me, Arthur," I said, stepping away. "I need to pay my respects." I left him standing there, clutching his scotch, his mind already racing, already wondering if he should call his broker in the morning. That was how it started. Not with a shout, but with a whisper. I continued my circuit of the room. I was a ghost haunting my own funeral. I saw my mother near the ice sculpture. She was surrounded by a gaggle of senators' wives. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her hand clutching a glass of champagne as if it were a life raft. She spotted me and her laughter cut off instantly. She excused herself and rushed over to me, her heels clicking frantically on the marble floor. She grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, the desperate strength of a woman trying to hold a crumbling facade together. "What are you doing?" she hissed through a clenched smile. "Why are you wearing black? You look like a witch. And why are you lurking?" "I am mingling, mother," I said, gently peeling her fingers off my arm. "I am being the dutiful daughter." "You are embarrassing the family," she whispered furiously. "People are talking. They are asking why you look so grim. Go over there and dance. Go smile at the Northglass partners. Wade is furious." I looked down at her. I felt a sudden, crushing wave of pity. She had spent 30 years curating this image. She had starved herself, silenced herself, and erased herself to be the perfect accessory for Wade Mercer, and she had no idea that by this time tomorrow, the name she protected so fiercely would be mud. "I am not embarrassing the family. Mother," I said softly. I am just standing at my true size. For the first time, I am not shrinking to fit into the frame. She stared at me, confused. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She saw something in my face that she hadn't seen before. She saw the end. She backed away from me, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't know what I was going to do, but she knew she didn't want to be standing next to me when the lightning struck. I turned away from her and walked toward the center of the room. The crowd parted for me. My silence was a force field. I saw Wade. He was standing in a circle of admirers, holding court. He looked magnificent in his tuxedo, the very picture of the American Titan. He was mid-sentence, boasting about the synergy of the new data corridors. When he saw me, he stopped talking. The silence rippled outward from him. The people around him turned to see what he was looking at. They saw me, standing 10 feet away, motionless, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. For a moment, I saw the flash of anger in his eyes. He wanted to march over and drag me out by my hair. He wanted to scream at me for ruining his perfect tableau with my somber presence. But then, the anger changed. Wade Mercer is a predator. And predators recognize when the dynamic of the hunt has shifted. He looked at my face. He expected to see defiance, or tears, or the petulant rebellion of a child who had been grounded. He saw none of that. He saw calm. He saw the absolute, terrifying serenity of someone who has already pulled the trigger and is just waiting for the bullet to land. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me and he was not disappointed. He was not angry. He was unsettled. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. It was microscopic, but I saw it. He wondered, just for a second, if he had missed something. I didn't say a word. I just nodded to him, a small, polite nod. It was a gesture of farewell. Graham appeared at his side. He was flushed with alcohol and victory. He wrapped an arm around our father's shoulder, grinning like a schoolboy who had just won the championship. "There she is," Graham called out, his voice a little too loud, a little too slurred. "The prodigal sister. Come to join the winner's circle. Joe." He raised his glass to me. The liquid sloshed over the rim. I looked at Graham. I looked at the man who had sold us out for a finder's fee. I looked at the brother who had mocked me my entire life. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a small, sharp thing. It was the smile of the person who knows exactly what is in the envelope that will be delivered to the Financial Chronicle in 12 hours. Graham's grin faltered. He saw the smile. He froze. The glass lowered slowly in his hand. The primitive part of his brain, the lizard brain that sensed danger, woke up. He looked from me to Wade, then back to me. "She knows." His eyes said, "I know everything." My eyes answered. The tension between us was a physical wire, pulled so tight it was humming. The people around us sensed it. The laughter died down. The air grew heavy. I had done what I came to do. I had planted the seed of doubt in the shareholders. I had shown my face so they couldn't say I was hiding, and I had let Graham know that his victory was a hallucination. "Enjoy the night, Graham," I said. My voice was clear, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "It is a very expensive party. You should savor every drop." I turned my back on them. It was the ultimate act of disrespect in the Mercer world. You do not turn your back on the king. But I did. I walked toward the exit. The click of my heels on the marble was steady, rhythmic. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I could feel their eyes on my back. I could feel Wade's confusion and Graham's rising panic. I could feel the curiosity of the 300 guests who were wondering why the daughter of the house was walking out of her own celebration like she was leaving a crime scene. I reached the heavy double doors. The doorman, a man named Henry who had worked here for 20 years, scrambled to open them for me. "Leaving so soon, Miss Gray?" he asked, surprised. "The cake hasn't even been cut." I stepped out into the cool, quiet hallway. The noise of the party, the clinking glass, the laughter. The music was instantly muffled as the doors swung shut behind me. It sounded distant, like a radio playing in another room. "I'm afraid I have an early morning. Henry, I said, pulling my wrap around my shoulders. Big changes are coming. I walked down the long corridor toward the elevators. I didn't look back. I had placed the weights on the scale. The data was in the inbox of the bank's risk officer. The whistleblower package was in the safe of the courier service, ready for the morning run. The trap for Graham was baited. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. Gravity is a constant. You can ignore it. You can pretend it doesn't apply to you because you are rich and powerful. You can build towers that scrape the sky and pretend you have conquered the earth. But eventually, if the foundation is rotten, gravity always wins. I leaned my head back against the cool metal wall of the elevator as it began to rise. I closed my eyes, let them drink their champagne, let them toast their billions. Tomorrow, the bill would come due, and I would be the only one with enough currency to pay it. The signing ceremony took place in the atrium of the Mercer Atlas headquarters. It is a cathedral of capitalism, a soaring glass void designed to make human beings feel small and money feel infinite. I was there, but not really. My father had allowed me to attend on the condition that I remain in the executive observation suite on the mezzanine level. It was a glass box floating 20 feet above the main floor, soundproofed and detached. "You can watch," Wade had told me that morning, his voice clipped and final. "But you will not speak, you will not mingle, you will witness the future of this family, and you will learn to appreciate it." So I stood behind the glass, looking down like a gargoyle on a cathedral ledge. Below me, the floor was a sea of dark suits and forced smiles. The press pen was packed tight, a phalanx of lenses trained on the long table in the center of the room. Wade sat in the middle, looking every inch the emperor. To his right sat the CEO of North Glass Capital, a man named Sterling who had the predatory grace of a shark in a tailored suit. To Wade's left was Graham. My brother looked radiant. He was vibrating with energy, leaning in to whisper something to our father, laughing at Sterling's jokes. From up here, he looked like the perfect heir. He looked like a man who had just pulled off the coup of the century. I looked at the clock on the wall of the suite. It was 1:59 in the afternoon. "Go ahead, Graham," I whispered to the empty room. "Pick up the pen." Down below, as if obeying my command, Graham reached for the platinum fountain pen lying on the velvet blotter. He uncapped it. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding stroboscopic wave. Wade signed first, then Sterling, then Graham. They stood up. They shook hands. They held the leather-bound contracts up for the cameras. The applause from the gathered executives and bankers was thunderous. Though up here, behind the soundproof glass, it was just a dull, rhythmic thudding. It was done. The $19 billion noose was officially around the neck of Mercer Atlas. I turned away from the window and walked to the small wet bar in the corner of the suite. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water. I did not drink alcohol. I needed my hands to be steady. At exactly 2:00, the automated scripts I had queued up on the remote servers executed. I didn't need to press a button. I didn't need a laptop. The fuse had been lit hours ago. The flame had just reached the powder. The first packet of data hit the inbox of Elias Thorne at Sovereign Trust. It contained the high-resolution thermal imaging of the port site, proving the ground was unstable silt, not bedrock. The second packet went to the investigative desk of the Financial Chronicle. It contained the metadata analysis of the forged EPA permits. The third packet was a silent ping to the Securities and Exchange Commission's automated tip line, flagging a suspicious routing number connected to the North Glass debt structure. I took a sip of water and turned back to the window. For the first 3 minutes, nothing happened. The applause died down. Waiters began to circulate with trays of champagne. Wade was beaming, clapping Sterling on the back. Graham was checking his reflection in a window, adjusting his tie. Then, I saw it. It started in the back of the room, near the cluster of junior analysts and associates who were glued to their phones. A head snapped up, then another. A whisper passed between 2 men in gray suits. They looked at their screens, then looked at the stage, then looked back at their screens with expressions of pure confusion. The vibration of a single phone is silent. The vibration of 200 phones receiving urgent market alerts simultaneously creates a sound. It is a low, insect-like hum, a frequency of panic that cuts through the air. I watched the ripple move through the crowd. It moved from the back to the front, like a wave of cold water. Smiles faltered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People began to reach into their pockets, pulling out their devices, refreshing their feeds. Down on the floor, the stock ticker on the giant wall screen was green. It showed Mercer Atlas up 3%. But the phones in their hands were telling a different story. I saw the chief financial officer, a man named Marcus who had known me since I was a baby, pull his phone out. He stared at it. His face went pale, draining of blood so fast it looked like he might faint. He looked up at Wade. He didn't smile. He started walking toward the stage, pushing through the crowd with an urgency that was entirely inappropriate for a celebration. Wade saw him coming. I saw my father's brow furrow. He leaned down to hear what Marcus was whispering. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the body language. Deny it. It is a rumor. It is impossible. Wade straightened up. He forced a smile back onto his face, a rictus of confidence. He waved a hand dismissively at Marcus. He turned back to Sterling, saying something that made the Northglass CEO laugh, though the laugh looked tight. But the room wasn't recovering. The hum was getting louder. The press pool, which had been packing up their gear, suddenly stopped. A reporter from Bloomberg was shouting into her phone. Another was typing furiously on a laptop he had propped open on a chair. Then, the ticker on the wall flickered. The green arrow stalled. It hovered for a second, confused, then it turned red. Mercer Atlas stock had just dropped 4% in 30 seconds. I watched Graham. He wasn't looking at the ticker. He was looking at his personal phone. I saw his hand tremble. He swiped the screen, reading something. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room, wild and terrified. He looked for Marcus. He looked for Wade. And then, he looked up. He looked directly at the mezzanine level. He couldn't see me clearly through the glare of the glass, but he knew I was there. He knew. He said something to Wade, then turned and practically ran off the stage. He shoved past a waiter, nearly knocking a tray of glasses to the floor. He was heading for the stairs. I took another sip of water. I waited. 2 minutes later, the door to the observation suite burst open. Graham stood there, his chest heaving. His face was a mask of sweat and terror. He slammed the door shut behind him, locking out the noise of the atrium, sealing us in the quiet box. "What did you do?" he hissed. He walked toward me, his hands clenched into fists. "What the hell did you do? Josephine." I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I looked at him with the mild curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat. "I didn't do anything, Graham," I said calmly. "I have been standing right here. I am grounded. Remember, no phone, no laptop, just a spectator." "Don't lie to me," he shouted, his voice cracking. He pulled his phone out and shoved it in my face. It was a news alert from the Financial Chronicle. The headline was in bold. Black letters, "Breaking Mercer Atlas Deal. Built on sand-leaked documents. Allege massive permit fraud in Greyhaven acquisition." "This dropped 5 minutes ago," Graham spat. "They have the metadata. Joe, they have the signature analysis. Only one person in the world looks at that kind of boring garbage. You?" "That is a very serious accusation," I said, setting my glass down on the table. "Especially since you signed the due diligence certificate. Didn't you check the metadata, Graham? Or were you too busy spending the finder's fee?" The color vanished from his face completely. He stopped moving. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. "What?" he whispered. "Vantage Point Consulting," I said. I let the name hang in the air between us. "Registered in Delaware, $2 million referral fee, wired to a trust in the Caymans, GM, private trust." Graham staggered back a step. He hit the back of the sofa and slumped down onto it, his legs giving out. The arrogance was gone. The golden boy facade had shattered, revealing the frightened child underneath. "You know," he stammered, "I know you shorted the family." "Graham," I said, my voice hardening, I know you set this up to fail. You wanted the company to take the hit, so you could walk away with a parachute and a side deal with Northglass." He looked up at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. Real tears. "I didn't want to hurt the company," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "I just wanted out. Joe, I wanted out." I frowned. This wasn't the defense I expected. "Out. You are the heir. You are the prince. I am a hostage," he cried out, gesturing wildly at the glass wall, at the figure of our father down below. "Look at him. He never stops. He never sleeps. He eats people. Joe, he has been eating me alive for 30 years. I can't do it anymore. I can't be him. I'm not a killer. I just wanted enough money to disappear. I wanted to go to Europe and never hear the name Mercer again." I stared at him. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had thought Graham was a monster. I thought he was greedy. But he wasn't. He was just weak. He was a man who had been crushed by the weight of Wade Mercer's expectations until he snapped. He didn't hate the family. He just wanted to escape it. And he was willing to burn the house down to cover his exit. "You could have just quit," I said softly. "No one quits Wade Mercer," Graham whispered, burying his face in his hands. "You know that. You leave in a box, or you leave in handcuffs. I thought if the company crashed, he would be busy. He wouldn't notice me slipping away." "Well," I said, looking down at the chaos unfolding on the floor below, "he is certainly going to be busy now." Downstairs, the situation had deteriorated into open panic. The stock ticker was now down 8%. Northglass CEO Sterling was shouting at his lawyers. Wade was surrounded by a ring of board members who looked like they were ready to draw knives. Suddenly, the door to the suite opened again. This time, it wasn't Graham. It was Wade. He didn't slam the door. He opened it slowly. He walked in with the heavy, deliberate gait of a man walking underwater. His tie was still perfect. His hair was still perfect, but his eyes were different. The blue ice was gone. In its place was a profound, terrifying confusion. He looked at Graham, slumped on the sofa, weeping into his hands. He looked at the headline on the news ticker that was now scrolling across the bottom of the television screen in the corner of the suite. Then he looked at me. He looked at the daughter he had dismissed as a child, the daughter he had silenced, the daughter he had put in a corner so the men could do business. He walked over to the window and looked down at his empire. He saw the shouting. He saw the plunging stock price. He saw the ruin of his legacy playing out in real time. He turned back to me. He didn't yell. He didn't issue an order. He didn't threaten to cut me off. For the first time in 30 years, Wade Mercer spoke to me not as a subordinate, but as an equal. "Josephine," he said. His voice was raspy, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "Josephine, what is happening?" I looked at him. I saw the fear behind the mask. He didn't know. He truly didn't know how the machine had broken. He had been so busy driving the train he hadn't noticed the tracks were gone. I picked up my glass of water again. I took a sip. "The truth is happening. Dad," I said quietly. "I told you the data speaks. You just refused to listen." I walked over to the table and picked up Graham's phone, which was still displaying the article about the fraud. I held it out to him. "You should read this," I said. "And then, we need to talk about how to save what is left." Wade looked at the phone. He looked at Graham, who couldn't even meet his eyes. And then he looked back at me. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted. It flowed away from the man in the tuxedo and settled on the woman in the black dress. He took the phone. His hand was shaking. "Tell me," he whispered. "Tell me what to do." The panic did not move like a wave. It moved like a virus. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the infection had jumped from the trading floor to the boardroom of Sovereign Trust. The lead underwriter for the deal had called an emergency liquidity summit. They did not invite my father to sit at the head of the table. They invited him to sit in the witness chair. I remained in the observation suite, watching the silent disintegration of the Mercer Atlas empire through the glass walls. My phone, which Graham had thrown at me earlier, was now buzzing with a relentless, angry rhythm. It was vibrating against the glass table like a trapped insect. Every vibration was a notification. The Financial Chronicle article had been shared 40,000 times in an hour. The headline was no longer a rumor. It was the narrative. Mercer Atlas buys a swamp. Due diligence ignored. Fraud suspected. The rumors of the debt call clause were spreading through the financial districts of London and New York. The wolves smell blood in the water long before they see the wound. Traders were shorting the stock, betting that the banks would demand their money back before the week was out. Down below, the celebration had turned into a triage unit. The waiters with the champagne trays had vanished, replaced by lawyers with armfuls of files. The festive blue lighting had been turned off, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead work lights. Wade Mercer was huddled with Marcus, the CFO. I could see my father's hands. They were animated, chopping the air, pointing fingers. But his posture was wrong. He was hunched. The Titan was shrinking. The banks were demanding collateral. They knew the $19 billion was gone, sunk into the mud of Greyhaven. Now they wanted to know what else they could take to cover their exposure. I knew exactly what they were asking for. They wanted the liquid assets. But Mercer Atlas was a modern giant. We were asset-rich but not cash-poor. We owned data centers, fiber optic lines, and automated warehouses. These are valuable, but you cannot sell a fiber optic line in an hour to pay a margin call. We were trapped in the growth story. My father had spent the last decade reinvesting every penny of profit back into expansion to keep the stock price high. He had run the company with zero fat, believing that momentum was the same thing as stability. Now, the momentum had hit a wall. I saw Marcus shake his head. He held up a tablet, showing Wade a spreadsheet. Wade stared at it. He ran a hand through his perfect silver hair, messing it up for the first time in public memory. He walked away from the group. He walked to the edge of the room and looked out at the street. He was doing the math. There was only one asset class he could liquidate instantly. The one thing that had real, tangible value independent of the stock market, the legacy fleet. The 3,000 red diesel trucks that formed the original backbone of the company, the trucks he had driven himself in the 1970s, the trucks that were the symbol of his self-made mythology. I had set the trap in the early morning. I had told the proxy to offer $1.5 billion cash for the fleet. Wade turned around. He looked like a man who had just been asked to shoot his own dog. He nodded to Marcus. It was done. He was selling his history to save his neck. The pain on his face was real. It wasn't about the money. It was about the story. If he sold the fleet, he was no longer the trucker who built an empire. He was just another corporate raider who stripped assets to cover bad debts. I felt a cold shiver of satisfaction, but it was mixed with a strange, hollow sadness. I was watching my father amputate his own identity. The door to the observation suite opened. My mother walked in. She had fled the gala the moment the stock ticker turned red. She was still wearing her cream cashmere outfit, but she looked disheveled. She didn't look at me. She walked to the wet bar and poured a glass of vodka. No ice, no mixer. She drank it in one swallow. "They are saying terrible things on the news. Josephine," she said, her voice trembling. "They are saying your father is a fraud. They are saying Graham is incompetent. The news is reporting the facts." "Mother," I said, staying by the window. Graham signed a contract without reading it. Wade bullied the board into silence. "This is the result." She slammed the glass down. "You could stop this. You are the smart one. You have always been the smart one. Go down there. Fix the computers. Make the numbers go back up." I turned to look at her. "I cannot fix gravity, Mom, and I cannot unsign a fraud." She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "If the stock goes down, if we lose the company, what happens to us? What happens to the house? What happens to the Hamptons?" I realized then that she wasn't worried about Wade. She wasn't worried about the 40,000 employees who might lose their pensions. She was worried about the cage. She had spent 30 years decorating her prison, and she was terrified of being evicted from it. "We might have to live like normal people," I said. It might be the best thing that ever happens to you." She flinched as if I had slapped her. She turned away, pouring another drink. She chose the vodka over the truth. She chose the prison because the door was locked from the inside. Downstairs, the atmosphere shifted again. A new group of people had arrived. They wore dark suits, but they weren't bankers. They moved with the aggressive, shark-like efficiency of crisis management consultants. The board of directors had panicked. They had hired an external firm, Blackwood and Associates, to scrub the scene and find a liability shield. They weren't here to save the company. They were here to save the board members from going to prison. I watched them swarm the conference table. They were demanding documents. They were seizing laptops. Graham was in the middle of them, talking fast, gesturing wildly. I could see the sweat glistening on his forehead even from 20 feet up. He was pointing at the ceiling. He was pointing at me. I knew exactly what he was saying. It is her fault. She is unstable. She leaked the documents to spite the family. She is a jealous, vindictive, hysterical woman who sabotaged the deal. He was trying to paint me as the villain. He was trying to say that the data was manipulated, that I had hacked the system to create a false panic. But facts are stubborn things. I saw the lead consultant, a woman with hair like steel wool and a face like a hatchet, stop Graham mid-sentence. She held up a piece of paper. It was the torn report. Someone had retrieved the pieces I had left on the floor of the boardroom the night before, or perhaps the secretary had kept a digital copy. The consultant read it. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the content. Warning permit fraud. Warning debt trap. She looked at Graham. She didn't look impressed. She looked at him with the cold disdain of a professional cleaner looking at a messy amateur. She turned to the chairman of the audit committee. She said something that made the chairman turn pale. They realized that the warning wasn't retroactive. It was preemptive. They realized that the company hadn't been blindsided. They had been warned, and they had willfully ignored it. That moved the needle from misfortune to gross negligence. Graham's smear campaign died before it could take a breath. The paper trail had strangled it. I turned away from the window. I had seen enough. The dominoes were falling exactly as Aurora had predicted. I needed to prepare for the endgame. I sat down on the sofa and pulled the e-ink device from the hidden pocket in my dress. I had smuggled it down with me. I activated Aurora. Status Mercer Atlas. Liquidation protocol active. Market cap minus 12%. Flag historical anomaly detected. I frowned, while the chaos was unfolding in the present. Aurora had been digging into the past. I had set her to scan the foundational documents of the company, the papers from 1985 that my mother had been so afraid of. The AI had found something. It wasn't just a gap in the financial records. It was a person. Entity, Silas Vance. Role co-founder erased. Asset link logistics algorithm V1. I stared at the screen. Silas Vance. The name sounded familiar. Then it clicked. Arthur Vance, the old shareholder I had spoken to at the gala, the man who had been with the company since the beginning. Silas was his brother. Aurora began to scroll through a series of legal threats and settlements from 40 years ago that had been buried in physical archives and never digitized until a third-party legal clerk scanned them by mistake in 2005. Silas Vance hadn't just been a partner. He was the genius. He was the one who wrote the original code for the logistics tracking system, the secret sauce that made Mercer Atlas faster than everyone else. Wade didn't write the code. Wade was the driver. Silas was the architect. But in 1986, Silas Vance disappeared from the company records. He didn't die. He was erased. Event forced buyout. Price $50,000. Condition non-disclosure agreement. Subsequent event S. Vance suicide, 1987. My stomach turned over. Wade had stolen the company. He had forced out the brilliant, quiet partner for pennies, rebranded the technology as his own instinct, and built a myth on a stolen foundation. And when Silas tried to fight back, Wade buried him under legal fees until the man took his own life. This was the primal crack. The entire empire was built on a crime. The rot wasn't just in the Greyhaven deal. The rot was in the DNA of the company. My father wasn't a hero who lost his way. He was a thief who got lucky. and Arthur Vance he had stayed. Why, to protect his brother's memory, or because Wade had bought his silence with shares. The intercom in the suite buzzed loudly. Startling my mother, she dropped her glass. It shattered on the floor. "Miss Gray?" The voice was mechanical, coming from the speaker on the wall. It was the head of the board of directors. "Yes," I said, pressing the button. "The board requests your presence in the main conference room immediately. Please bring any and all documentation you possess regarding the Greyhaven analysis." There was a pause. "And Miss Gray, do not speak to the press on your way down." I looked at my mother. She was staring at the broken glass on the floor, weeping silently. She was broken, just like the glass. "I have to go, Mom," I said. I stood up. I smoothed the skirt of my black dress. I picked up the e-ink device and slipped it into my clutch. They didn't want me down there to thank me. They wanted me down there to find a way to blame me. They wanted a scapegoat. They wanted to find a way to say that my unauthorized interference caused the stock drop, not the fraud itself. They wanted a name to throw into the sea to calm the storm. I walked to the door. I looked back at the glass box one last time. It was a beautiful cage, but I was done with cages. I wasn't going down there as a victim. I was going down there as the prosecutor. I had the current fraud in one hand and the ancient crime in the other. "Come on, Aurora," I whispered, patting the clutch. "Let's go meet the board." I opened the door and stepped out onto the mezzanine. The noise of the crisis hit me like a physical wave shouting, ringing phones, the smell of fear. I began to descend the stairs. Every step was a drumbeat. Wade Mercer thought he was having a bad day because he lost $19 billion. He had no idea. His bad day was just beginning. The double doors to the main boardroom were made of solid mahogany, 3 inches thick, designed to keep secrets in and the world out. I pushed them open with a single hand. The room was freezing. The air conditioning had been cranked down to compensate for the body heat of 20 people who were sweating through their expensive suits. The long table, a slab of polished black walnut that ran the length of the room, was crowded. The board of directors sat along the sides. The crisis management consultants from Blackwood and Associates stood against the walls like sentinels. At the head of the table, the chair's seat, my father's seat, was empty. I did not wait for an invitation. I did not ask for permission to speak. I walked to the opposite end of the table, placed my clutch on the surface, and stood. I was the only person standing. "Miss Gray," the lead director said. His name was Harrison, a man who had run 3 banks and destroyed 2 of them. He looked at me with a mixture of exhaustion and irritation. "We asked for the documents. We did not ask for a speech. We are in the middle of a liquidity crisis." "I know what you are in the middle of, Harrison," I said. My voice was low, stripped of any inflection. "You are in the middle of a crime scene. I am just here to identify the body." I opened my clutch and took out the e-ink device. I placed it on the table. It looked like a piece of space junk compared to the sleek tablets and laptops scattered around the room. "You want to know why the stock is down 12%, I said. "You want to know why the banks are calling the loans. You are looking for a scapegoat. You want to pin this on a rogue algorithm or an emotional outburst from a family member. That is the narrative Graham tried to sell you an hour ago." I tapped a key on the projected keyboard. The screen on the wall behind me, which had been displaying the plummeting stock price, flickered and changed. It showed a timeline, simple, brutal, linear. "Yesterday morning, at 8:30, I began, pointing at the screen. I presented a risk assessment to the CEO and the Chief Operating Officer. The assessment flagged the Greyhaven permits as fraudulent. It flagged the North Glass debt structure as toxic. The room was silent. I could hear the hum of the projector fan. "At 8:45, I continued. "Wade Mercer physically destroyed the physical copy of that report. At 9 o'clock, he confiscated my electronic devices, revoked my security clearance, and confined me to the penthouse level under guard." I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every director. "I did not fail to warn the company," I said. "The company failed to listen. I was not negligent. I was silenced. And the reason I was silenced is because the truth was inconvenient for the stock price. "This is hearsay," a director named Blaine muttered. He was a close friend of my father's golf game. "You are claiming you predicted a complex fraud that 200 lawyers missed. That is convenient." "Josephine." "It is not convenient," I countered. "It is math." I gestured to the device on the table. "I built a system called Aurora. It is not magic. It is not a crystal ball. It is a heuristic engine that scrapes public data satellite imagery, maritime logs, court filings, and looks for patterns that human beings are paid to ignore. Your lawyers missed the fraud because they were paid by the hour to close the deal. Aurora missed nothing because she does not have a bank account." Harrison leaned forward. "So you are saying this machine knew?" "I am saying the data was there," I said. The ground at the port was soft. The signatures on the permits were copied. The debt was a trap. It was all there in the public domain. I put it on a piece of paper. My father tore it up. The mood in the room shifted. It went from skeptical to cold. They were realizing that this wasn't just bad luck. If I could prove that the CEO had been handed a warning and destroyed it, the insurance policies that protected the directors from personal liability would be void. They were suddenly looking at their own bank accounts. "Where is Graham?" a woman named Elena asked. She was the head of the ethics committee, a position that was usually ceremonial. Today, it was real. "Graham is unavailable," Harrison said quickly. "He sent word that he is suffering from severe exhaustion. He is under medical observation." "He is suffering from exposure," I corrected. I tapped the keyboard again. The timeline on the screen vanished, replaced by a complex web of financial transactions. It looked like a map of a nervous system. "This is the transaction log for the finder's fee paid to Vantage Point Consulting," I said. $2 million. It was paid yesterday, upon the signing of the letter of intent. I traced the line on the screen with my finger. It flowed from the Mercer Atlas General Fund through a Delaware shell company and landed in a trust account in the Cayman Islands. "The beneficial owner of the GM Private Trust is not a mystery," I said. "It is Graham Mercer." A gasp went around the room. It wasn't theatrical. It was the sharp intake of breath that happens when people realize they are standing in a room with a traitor. "Graham bet against the house," I said. "He knew the deal would collapse. He structured it to collapse. He took a fee to walk North Glass through the front door, knowing they were carrying a bomb. He isn't sick. Elena, he is hiding." Harrison took off his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked 10 years older than he had when I walked in. "Jesus," he whispered. "If this gets out." "It is already out," I said. "I sent the data to the SEC an hour ago." "You did what?" Blaine shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You invited the feds into our house. Are you insane? You are a Mercer." "I am a shareholder," I replied, my voice hard as diamond, "and I am protecting my equity from criminals, even if they share my last name." The double doors opened again. Wade Mercer walked in. He looked different. The impeccable armor was cracked. His tie was crooked. His eyes were red-rimmed. He walked with a heavy, aggressive step, trying to reclaim the dominance he had held in this room for 40 years. He stopped at the head of the table. He put his hands on the back of his empty chair. He looked at me. Then he looked at the screen displaying Graham's financial treason. "Turn that off," Wade commanded. His voice was a growl. No one moved. The screen stayed on. "I said turn it off," Wade shouted, his voice echoing off the wood paneling. "This is a private board meeting. Josephine has no standing here. She is suspended. Get security in here." "Sit down." "Wade," Harrison said. It was spoken quietly, but it landed like a hammer. Wade froze. He turned his head slowly to look at Harrison. "Excuse me." "I said sit down," Harrison repeated. He didn't look away. "You are not chairing this meeting. You are the subject of it." Wade looked around the room. He looked for allies. He looked for the men he had made rich. He looked for the friends he had invited to his holiday parties. They were all looking at their papers. They were looking at the floor. They were looking anywhere but at him. The pack had turned, the alpha was wounded, and they were distancing themselves from the smell of blood. Wade sank into the chair. He didn't look like a titan anymore. He looked like an old man who had lost his keys. "It was Graham," Wade whispered. "I didn't know. You have to believe me. My son, he betrayed me. I am the victim here." "You are not a victim, Wade," I said. "You are the architect." Wade looked at me. "I built this company," he hissed. "I built it from 3 trucks and a roadmap. I drove the routes myself. I sweat for this. You think you can come in here with your little computer and judge me? You have never built anything. That is the problem, isn't it?" I asked. "The story, the myth of the self-made man. You love that story. You have told it so many times I think you actually believe it." I walked closer to him. The room was so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. "But Aurora found a ghost in the machine. Dad!" I tapped the key one last time. The screen changed again. The financial web vanished. In its place was a scanned image of a legal document from 1985. It was yellowed with age, typed on a typewriter, stamped with the seal of a notary public who had been dead for 20 years. The header read, "Transfer of Intellectual Property, Vance Algorithms to Mercer Logistics." "Who is Silas Vance?" I asked. Wade flinched. It was a violent, physical reaction, as if I had burned him with a cigarette. His face went gray. "That is irrelevant," he stammered. "Ancient history. It is the foundation," I said, turning to the board. "Mercer Atlas claims to be the leader in logistics because of our proprietary routing software, the Mercer method. We tell the market that Wade Mercer developed it using his intuition as a driver." I pointed to the screen. "He didn't. Silas Vance did. Silas Vance was the co-founder of this company. He was the mathematician. He wrote the code that gave us our edge. And in 1985, just before the company went public, Wade forced him out. He bought him out for $50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement that carried a penalty of ruin." I looked at Wade. He was shrinking in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles were white. "Silas Vance killed himself 2 years later," I said. "And you erased him. You took his name off the patents. You took his name off the history. You built a $19 billion empire on stolen genius and a dead man's silence." I looked at Arthur Vance, the old director who had spoken to me at the gala. He was sitting at the far end of the table. He was weeping. He had known, all this time, he had known, and he had taken the dividends as hush money. "The fraud with Greyhaven is not an accident," I told the room. "It is a habit. This company was born in a lie. It has lived in a lie. And today, the bill came due." Harrison looked at the document on the screen. He looked at Wade, who was staring at the table, unable to speak, unable to defend the indefensible. "The culture of deception comes from the top," I said, delivering the final blow. "Graham lied because he was taught that lying is how you do business. He learned it from you, Dad." Harrison cleared his throat. He stood up. "Wade," he said, his voice formal and final, "we are going to need you to step outside. The board needs to deliberate." "You can't do this," Wade whispered. "I am Mercer Atlas." "Not anymore," Harrison said. "Now, you are a liability." Wade stood up. He looked at me one last time. There was no anger left in his eyes, just a vast, empty shock. He walked to the door. He didn't look back. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind him with a final, resonant click. The room exhaled. Harrison turned to me. He looked at the device on the table, then at me. There was respect in his eyes, but it was the cold, calculating respect of a man looking at a dangerous weapon. "Thank you, Josephine," he said. "You have saved us from a total collapse. We can spin this. We can say we discovered the irregularities internally. We can place the blame on Wade and Graham. We can purge the leadership." "I expect you will," I said. "We will need to appoint an interim CEO," Harrison said, glancing at the other directors. "Someone to steer the ship through the bankruptcy restructuring. Someone the market sees as clean. He didn't offer me the job. He didn't promise me the seat, but the implication was there. They needed a face that wasn't tarnished. But I knew how these men worked. They were grateful now because I had handed them the knife to cut out the cancer. But tomorrow, I would be the woman who betrayed her father. I would be the snitch. I would be the dangerous variable that couldn't be controlled. They would use me to stabilize the stock, and then they would push me out. They would pat me on the head, give me a board seat with no power, and bring in an outsider to run the company. I picked up my device. I slipped it back into my clutch. "Suspend them," I said. "Issue the press release. Tell the market that the Mercer family is cleaning its own house. It is the only way to stop the bleeding." "And you?" Harrison asked. "Where will you be?" "I will be in the office," I said, "running the servers, because unlike the rest of you, I actually know how the engines work." I turned and walked out. I had won the battle in the boardroom. Wade was out. Graham was finished. But the war wasn't over. As I walked down the silent corridor, I knew that Harrison and the others were already plotting how to neutralize me. I had exposed the rot, but I was still standing in the wreckage. I needed one final move. I needed to make sure that when the dust settled, I wasn't just the janitor who cleaned up the mess. I needed to be the owner of the building, and I knew exactly how to do it. The restructuring, the survival parts of the company. I wasn't just going to save the company. I was going to carve it up and keep the heart for myself. Gravity had done its work. Now, it was time for architecture. The collapse of the Mercer Atlas Group did not happen in slow motion. It happened with the violent, terrifying speed of a high-speed train derailment. 48 hours after I walked into the boardroom, the official investigation into North Glass Capital was announced by the Department of Justice. The news broke at 6 a.m. By noon, the Greyhaven Port Nexus project was officially frozen by federal order. The $19 billion valuation that my father and brother had toasted to just 2 days ago evaporated. It turned into a vapor of lawsuits and criminal subpoenas. The termination clause in the merger agreement, the one North Glass had hidden to protect themselves, backfired spectacularly. Because the fraud was rooted in the permit application itself, the contract was voided ab initio. But the damage to the Mercer name was not something that could be undone with legal arguments. We were radioactive. The liquidity war began immediately. The banks, led by Sovereign Trust, did not wait for phone calls. They issued notices of default. They froze the operating lines of credit that kept our trucks on the road and our servers cooling. The creditors descended like vultures on a carcass that was still twitching. They wanted assets. They wanted blood. The boardroom became a bunker. For 3 days, I did not leave the building. I slept on a leather sofa in the executive lounge. I ate vending machine sandwiches. I drank coffee that tasted like battery acid. Graham tried to kill me one last time. It was on the morning of the 3rd day. The stock was trading at $12, down from $85. Graham, who had been hiding in his office with his personal lawyers, stormed into the temporary war room where I was working with the crisis team. He looked like a ghost. His eyes were sunken, his skin gray. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She did it!" he screamed to the room full of forensic accountants and federal regulators. "She manipulated the market. She shorted the stock through a shell company. This is insider trading. Arrest her." The room went silent. The regulators looked at me. I didn't look up from my laptop. I was running a simulation on Aurora to save the pension fund. "I did not short the stock, Graham," I said, my voice calm in the dead air. "I utilized the whistleblower protection statutes under the Dodd-Frank Act. My legal team filed the disclosures with the SEC concurrent with the press leak. I have not made a single dollar from this crash. In fact, my trust fund has lost 40% of its value." I looked up at him then. "I didn't do this for profit," I said. "I did it for hygiene." The federal agent standing near the door stepped forward. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Graham. "Mr. Mercer," the agent said, "we have some questions regarding the GM private trust in the Cayman Islands. If you would please come with us." Graham looked at me. He looked for the sister who used to cover for him when he broke things. He saw only a stranger. He slumped, the fight leaving his body like air leaving a balloon. He let them lead him away. He didn't look back. That afternoon, I received a summons to the chairman's office. The office was quiet. The phones had stopped ringing because there was no one left to answer them. The executive assistants had all been sent home. Wade Mercer was standing by the window. The room was dark, the blinds drawn against the glare of the paparazzi helicopters circling the building. He was packing a box. It was a small cardboard box, the kind an intern uses on their last day. He held a framed photograph in his hand. It was a picture of him and Silas Vance, standing in front of the very first Mercer truck in 1979. I closed the door behind me. "You won," he said. He didn't turn around. His voice was hollow. It lacked the resonant boom that had commanded boardrooms for 4 decades. "I didn't win, Dad," I said. "We all lost. I just made sure we didn't die." He turned to face me. He looked old. The Titan was gone. The myth was gone. All that was left was a man who had spent his life running from a lie. "I didn't steal it for the money," he said, looking at the photo. Silas, he was brilliant, a genius, but he had no stomach for the fight. He wanted to stay small. He wanted to be a trucking company. I saw the empire. I saw the world. "So you crushed him," I said. "I did what was necessary," Wade replied, his voice hardening slightly. "I took the wheel. I drove this company to heights Silas couldn't even dream of. I built the skyline. Josephine, does that count for nothing?" "It counts," I said. "But you built it on a graveyard. And you taught your son that the only way to build was to cheat. That is why Graham betrayed you. He was just doing what he thought a Mercer does." Wade flinched. The truth hit him harder than the bankruptcy notices. I walked over to his desk. I placed a document on the black marble surface. It was a single page. "What is this?" he asked. "It is a restructuring plan," I said. "Aurora ran the models. The toxic assets, the Greyhaven debt. The North Glass liability, we ring-fenced them into a bad bank entity. We let that entity go bankrupt. It takes the Mercer name with it." I pointed to the second paragraph. "But the core," I continued. "The logistics network, the data infrastructure, the 40,000 employees who actually do the work. We spin that out into a new company, a clean company. We save the jobs. We save the pensions." Wade looked at the paper. He looked at the numbers. He understood them instantly. It was a brilliant maneuver. It was the only way out. "But there is a condition," I said. "There always is," he murmured. "You resign," I said. "Effective immediately. You surrender your voting shares to the employee trust, and you cooperate fully with the DOJ investigation into Graham and Northglass. You take your share of the blame to shield the innocent staff." "And if I refuse?" he asked, looking up at me. "Then I release the rest of the Silas Vance archive," I said. "I release the letters where you threatened his family. I release the proof of the patent theft. You won't just be bankrupt, Dad. You will be a pariah. You will go to prison for historical fraud." He stared at me. He looked for the little girl in the pigtails. He looked for the teenager he had sent to etiquette school. He looked for the woman he had grounded 3 days ago. He didn't find them. He picked up his pen. It was the same platinum pen he had used to sign the Greyhaven deal. He hesitated. "I did it for you," he whispered. "For you and Graham. To give you a kingdom." "We didn't need a kingdom," I said softly. "We needed a father." He looked down at the paper. His hand shook. Just once. Then he signed. The scratch of the nib on the paper was the loudest sound in the world. He capped the pen and pushed the paper toward me. "You were right," he said. The words came out like stones falling from a cliff. "Josephine, you were right." He picked up his box. He walked past me. He didn't touch me. He didn't hug me. The distance between us was measured in billions of dollars and decades of silence. He opened the door and walked out of his office, out of the tower, and out of history. I stood alone in the office. I looked at the signature. I looked at the plan Aurora had generated. I picked up the phone on the desk, the secure line to the board. I dialed Harrison. "It is done," I said. "Wade is out. Execute the restructuring protocol. We save the employees. We sell the jet. We sell the penthouses. We keep the trucks and the code." "And you?" Harrison asked. "Do you want the CEO chair?" "It is yours if you want it." I looked around the room. I looked at the black marble desk. I looked at the view of the city, the same view that had been my prison cell just a few days ago. "No," I said. "I am a builder. Harrison, not a keeper. Find someone else to sit in the chair. I have other systems to build." I hung up. I walked out of the office. I took the elevator down the public elevator, not the private executive one. I stood shoulder to shoulder with the analysts and the secretaries who were packing up their desks, unsure if they had jobs tomorrow. "It's going to be okay," I told a young woman who was crying into a tissue. "The jobs are safe. The pension is safe." She looked at me, surprised that a mercer was speaking to her. She didn't know who I was. I walked out through the revolving doors and onto the street. The air in New York was cold and smelled of exhaust and roasted nuts. It was the smell of reality. The paparazzi were there, shouting my name, flashing their cameras. "Ms. Gray, Ms. Gray. Is it true your father is out? Is it true the company is bankrupt?" I didn't answer. I put on my sunglasses. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from Aurora. Protocol not complete. System status rebooting. New user identity unbound. I smiled. I wasn't an heiress anymore. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a daughter grounded in a penthouse. I was broke, by billionaire standards. My inheritance was gone. My family was shattered. But as I walked down the avenue, merging into the stream of millions of people fighting for their own survival, I realized something. The invisible collar was gone. The heavy golden chains were gone. I took a deep breath. The cold air filled my lungs. The door was open. And for the first time in 30 years, I didn't need anyone's permission to walk through it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It was a long journey from the penthouse prison to the freedom of the streets, and I'm glad you walked it with me. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening on your commute, at the gym, or maybe hiding in your office like I used to? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice and revenge, please make sure to subscribe to Maya Revenge Stories. Hit that like button. And if you really want to support the channel, smash that hype button so we can get this story out to more people.